Hello and welcome to the September BigFix briefing room. My name is Michelle McGough and I'm here with Mr. Joe Saylor. And this month we've got some of the usual and some really fun stuff in store for you. We'll start off with the usual, the Microsoft Patch Tuesday CVE overview. Joe's going to do a couple of breakdowns for that. And then we are going to reintroduce an 80s action star who has come back to be in action. Screenshots are the new leak this month. There's a big Linux network vulnerability, so hold out for the Linux kernel updates. And we've got new Red Hat Enterprise Linux patch content to talk about as well. Joe, do you want to kick it off with Microsoft?
Yeah, of course. So this month we have a total of 79 CVEs, around 290 fixlets covering all of them. There are 4 0 days, one of which is an actively exploited critical that has kind of come back from the grave. And then there's also a large pile of SQL exploits. There's really only 2 kind of major ones in there, but there's a ton of CVEs just because there's a little bit of a cross product going on. Each SQL version has a different CVE number, even though it's the same exploit.
Oh, thanks. You want to break down the 0 days?
Yeah, so all of the 0 days this month, at least ones that aren't the massive critical, are kind of user phishing style exploits. There has been a link file bypass of app control and mark of the web warnings. It's been exploited since 2018, if that tells you how common these things are. This one is a little bit bad in that it can, and that it removes protections from users that do get phished. So if they click a link, normally you would expect to see a warning or an extra confirmation dialog. And then this exploit removes those warnings. So it's a single click to exploit rather than the 2 or 3 clicks that you would expect to see out of a link file.
Okay.
Something pretty similar in Microsoft Publisher. There is a actively exploited vulnerability that requires a user to open a malicious file. This one actually explicitly bypasses macro security settings that allows, you would normally have these disabled in your environment just as a rule. It's very common because it allows malicious files like this to execute whatever they want. So this bypasses that and allows malicious files to do worse things than you would have expected them to do otherwise.
Did I understand that right? You said it's common to have this disabled and this vulnerability goes around that.
Correct. Yeah. So it's pretty standard practice in most Microsoft products as a security policy to disable macros in general.
Right. Yeah.
And in this case, I would expect most of our users to have them disabled, but this bypasses that security feature.
Ouch. 6.8 isn't quite feeling high enough, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, it seems worse to me than a 6.8 as well. But that's kind of where it landed. This one of the user phishing style CVEs is probably the worst one to me.
Yeah. And I was commenting to Joe, I've started seeing a pattern where these like mid-tier ratings always seem to come back to issues that could have been prevented if end users were successfully going through their security training and actually, retaining that knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, keeping your guard up is that's the best way to not get your system owned. But you've got however many thousands of users that all need to keep their guard up simultaneously, and that's where these slip in.
Yeah.
So similarly, we have an elevation of privilege in Windows installer. This does require a user to download a malicious MSI file, which I feel like users are generally better trained on to not just click on random MSIs. Like I feel like we as a society have moved beyond that. But it does allow any MSI to elevate to system privileges and do whatever system can do on the box, which is not great, especially if you are already following best practice and not allowing users to have admin rights. So this elevation can be pretty dangerous in that regard.
Doesn't Windows installer run at system level though anyway, or is this about enabling the user to artificially elevate it when they shouldn't be able to?
Yeah, so a non-admin user always runs in the user context for installers. They can't
Right.
install to the administrator profile.
Right.
And so this allows any administrator profile activity to happen from the user context.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Joe.
All right, so moving on to the SQL space. So these are not actively exploited, but there's two pretty large forks this month in terms of SQL vulnerabilities. Each of these columns here has probably 7 or 8 CVEs associated with them, which is why there isn't any CVE data on the screen, because it would be just an unreadable glob of text.
Sure.
But it's essentially just one CVE per version of SQL. The two main paths here, the two main vulnerabilities are, first we have an elevation of privileges. So any low privileged user with the vulnerable OLE driver installed can elevate to database administrator. And that's bad enough from an access perspective. But when we think about what you can do with SQL administrator, you can really pivot outward quite a lot. So SQL is capable of running Windows commands, right? You can use the sp-exec command to run whatever you want. And so now suddenly this is like it's a pretty big pivot, even though it's kind of a lower priority elevation of privilege. I think maybe this one's going to sneak under the radar quite a bit.
Yeah, I haven't seen any researchers really talking about this yet. It's early, so hopefully they will, but I'm glad you caught this, Joe. Thanks.
Yeah, and then the other side to SQL this month is a remote code execution vulnerability in native scoring. I think most people probably aren't familiar with native scoring, but it's a thing that's enabled by default on everything newer than SQL 2017, and it's a machine learning function of SQL. So you basically point a model that's already been trained at a set of data, which is just a SQL query, and then it tries to predict data based on those two inputs. And that's really not that important to know. The only important thing is that it is enabled by default. So any user that's authenticated can access native scoring, feed it a malicious model and a malicious SQL query, and run whatever code they want on the SQL box.
Okay. Okay. And so what you said is that this then would be used by a couple of people. And in our customer base, I mean, virtually everybody has some SQL. This could be used by someone that's actually doing machine learning work, right? They've got something that's running that, like intentionally. But if somebody just set up SQL for something else, this is enabled by default. And if they didn't know to harden the OS and disable that, it's just sitting out there vulnerable.
Correct. Right? Yeah.
Okay.
And one of my main takeaways from this is these both require authentication of some sort. So a user does have to be compromised. I really expect these to be more vulnerable in the non-production SQL Server space. Typically, at least as far as I have seen at my customers, a SQL box that's in production and doing production things will be relatively hardened in terms of user access. Right, so most big data SQL boxes only have a few users that can access them, right? You don't have the everyone group in Active Directory as a reader on your database. Right. Like that's practically never the case. However, test boxes typically are not controlled that well in terms of user access. I very frequently see just the users group as a reader on a test database. And that's like a pretty big pivot point if, attacker has any sort of, has compromised any sort of low user account, then they can get into these test boxes, run a malicious native scoring query, and then pivot to whatever they want from there.
So are you recommending better security hygiene in test environments?
I am a big fan of security showers. Yeah, you definitely want to do that, especially in test environments. I just very frequently see just lazy hardening on test environments, and this is a good reminder that you should take a strong look at it.
Thanks, Joe.
All right, and then the big one that everybody's talking about, if you have taken a look at any security stuff in the last day or two, you probably noticed this one. So Windows 10 1507, it does come in at a 9.8 on the CVSS scale. It is unauthenticated remote control of these older Windows 10 1507 boxes. It's the long-term servicing branch, so it's been end of life for quite a while. But of course, everyone knows it's kind of difficult to get rid of all Windows 10 boxes. I'm sure there's like some Windows 98 stuff out there too. Um, so this is out there. It's a huge vulnerability. It's actually a rollback of a very old 2015 vulnerability. There was a update in March that rolled this back, so it's been vulnerable again for quite a while. The arms race portion of this is really the announcement. So because it's an old vulnerability, there is code out there that can take advantage of it. It is a network vulnerability. So, anywhere there's this Windows 10 box and an attacker can see it on the network, they can kind of take it over because there is code already available for this. The only reason it hasn't been a bigger problem so far is that there was no announcement for it. This CVE announcement, now that it's been disclosed that it's a vulnerability again, we're for sure going to see a huge uptake in attackers scanning for Windows 10 boxes. So even though it's been vulnerable for a while and hasn't really been a problem, this disclosure makes it more of a problem. So this is a big priority to get patched if you still have Windows 10 1507 boxes on your network.
Okay, yeah, thanks for pointing this out. When I read through the research on this, I saw that there's more than one patch, right? There's the servicing stack update and the security update that need to be applied because of that rollback. So
same deal as usual with Windows 10. Servicing stack always just has to be applied, and then the patch has to be applied. This happens to be a vulnerability in the servicing stack, so that makes it more important to apply the servicing stack.
Thanks, Joe. What's next? Oh, yes. Okay. Vulnerabilities of the month. So one of the things that's unique about the briefing room is that, there's so many vulnerabilities, we can't realistically cover them all. What Joe tries to do is pick out things that are, urgent or high risk where the risk score wasn't really accurate, or vice versa, where there's something that's low risk but, got maybe too high of a score, or just things that are interesting. So looking forward to what you have for us this month.
We have something interesting. Houston, we have an interesting thing. So there is a new vulnerability. It's called Rambo, of course. I didn't make this up, but if somebody's going to hand me Sylvester Stallone on a plate, I'm going to use it. It's just how life is.
You used Paint?
I actually graduated up to Paint 3D for this one. The technology of MS Paint was a little on the low side. Couldn't quite do it.
Okay.
So we got new technology here for our graphics. It's named Rambo because it is an exploit based around RAM memory in the box. It essentially turns RAM into a transmitter. So some genius / idiot found out that if you turn RAM off and turn it back on quickly, it emits a little radio signal. And so they came up with a whole algorithm and some software to match that rapidly turns RAM on and off on an exploited system, and then with a matching receiver can decode that back into binary. So it essentially turns RAM into Wi-Fi. This doesn't sound that exciting because it runs at a stately 1/10 of a kilobyte per second. We're not talking about a ton of data here. That's probably enough to shoot out some keylogger data, some text files. Really not a lot. We're not talking about exfiltrating a database here. But it is a novel attack for air-gapped systems. Anyone, say in a government facility, probably knows how secure these air-gapped devices are. So that's a device that is not allowed to contact the outside network. That's basically what air-gap means. And so any way to turn just like standard equipment like this into a transmitter completely circumvents that air gap strategy. And these are always, very sensitive devices with very sensitive data on them.
I want to ask about this because I find this fascinating. Who would be a realistic target for this? And I say this knowing that this technique of, getting data from a radio signal is nothing new. I mean, I think I read somewhere that they did something with CRTs like ages ago. And so the difference here is that it's using RAM for the radio signal. Yeah. But if I think of air-gapped environments, and we've seen those, we both have in our career, we've seen those. I mean, aren't they going to be in like a Faraday cage or something? I feel like this wouldn't be as likely, but maybe in corporate, like not so much state, right?
Yeah, I mean, the likelihood of exploitation here is below the floor. Like, for sure, it would be very difficult to get this onto a box to begin with because, again, it's air-gapped. However, if somebody grabs a USB drive off the ground and plugs it into their air-gap system, which, again, very unlikely, it's just that it's a novel way to get data off that box. And no matter how unlikely it is, it's now something that we have to live with in our nightmares.
I'm not going to lie. I actually thought about like, how hard would it be to set this up and prove it? It just sounded like fun,
That's very interesting. Yeah,
it is. Yeah, but you're right. I mean, there'd be no opportunity to actually really use it, but it's cool. All right. Well, how are you going to top that?
Well, unfortunately, there's very little that can top Rambo shooting memory sticks that turn into Wi-Fi at a state actor. Like, that's not something I can top, but I do have poor Monopoly Man for you here. So, close? I made an attempt. An attempt was made. So here's another new fun. It's not fun. Again, it's a thing of nightmares.
I read about this.
Yeah, there's a newish. It's certainly been around for a little while. Bit of malware called Spy Agent, and it basically uses optical character recognition to read through all of your pictures. It's an Android piece of malware, and just read text and find passphrases in that text. The whole reason this kind of works is that for crypto wallets, it's very common to have a passphrase that's between 12 and 24 words. Mm-hmm. And so it can be really difficult to remember. And it's just been very common to have these recovery passphrases screenshot so that they can, you can remember them. I think Bitcoin even recommends that you write them down somewhere so that you don't lose it, so you can recover your wallet. This software lets somebody else recover your wallet and turns you into the poor Monopoly Man.
So when I read about this, I think it was something happening somewhere in Asia, maybe Korea, China. Is this making its way west?
I mean, the internet is a global phenomenon. I don't know if you've noticed. Yeah. It's making its way everywhere.
Yeah, it must be escalating if that's coming up again. Yeah, this is really good. Unfortunate, but really interesting.
Yeah, and it kind of highlights for me the line between password complexity being strong, like you want strong password complexity, but then too much, and now people are writing down and saving their passwords again, and you've wrapped all the way around to poor security because your password requirements are too great.
All right, what's next? Oh, okay. I saw this slide and I wasn't really sure, so I'm just going to talk you through what I see here, and maybe you can reel me in. And normally in Linux kernel security, we'll see like a few 7s, maybe in terms of severity, and I see a 9.8 remote code execution vulnerability. So big deal. Folks are going to need to deal with that. But then what I see on the slide is a way to translate the CVSS scope. and I have no idea what all of that means.
Yeah, that's the main point of
Oh.
this slide, is to be a brutal glob of text. And this isn't stuff that I made up. This is the actual text from the CVE.
Mhm.
You'll note that it's written in like fairly technical language. There's very specific, Linux calls here that, frankly, I don't understand just reading them, right? Like I had to go research what each of these calls do to understand what is happening here. And nobody has time for that. You can't read through this. And believe it or not, this is like the relevant part of the vulnerability. There's more text and it makes even less sense. For instance, from this text here, it's really difficult to understand the attack vector, like how am I being exploited here? And it's really difficult to understand what an attacker could do with that exploitation. I don't know offhand in Linux what misaccounting of the server in-flight value means. Like, what can an attacker do with
Okay. Okay.
that? So, enter the CVSS ratings. The scope text that you see all the time in, any CVEs, if you've ever done any research, is this just, again, brutal glob of text, clearly meant to be machine readable, difficult to look at for a human, but it really gives you a lot of clues as to what's going on with any of these vulnerabilities. And this is specific to this one vulnerability, of course, but all of this data applies to any vulnerability you'll see out there. Anything with a CVSS 3 score will have this information, and it can give you clues as to what the vulnerability really is,
Oh,
how it impacts
yeah.
you,
Yeah.
without having to know the specifics. So in this case, the Linux vulnerability is for CIFS, which is basically a file sharing protocol. So it's only like a Linux server thing. That does mean it's a network vulnerability here. So if you take a look at that top string, try to take a look at it anyway. Again, very difficult to eyeball it. We have the left four sets of values are essentially the attack vector, like how they describe how this vulnerability could be exploited, what its requirements are to be exploited. So in this case, we have the attack vector, that's the AV value. It's set to N, and there's only a few different values for these. So, as you look at and evaluate more of these, you'll begin to kind of understand what each of the letters mean for the actual values for each of these categories. So in this case, AVN is the attack vector, is network. So that means anywhere that this vulnerability exists, if an attacker has network line of sight on it, then they can exploit it. So it is not a local exploit. It's anyone with a TCP connection. And that's the worst thing it can be. There's no worse value for this than network. We also have the attack complexity. This is how hard it is for an attacker to actually take advantage of it. In this case, we have it listed as low complexity. In the text for the vulnerability itself, I got no sense of how difficult it would be to take advantage of this exploit. So this really helps me understand that it doesn't take a lot of knowledge. It just takes someone with a bit of code, right? Whatever the exploit code is, they can take advantage of it. So there's no like weird conditions that they have to satisfy first.
Okay. Yeah, and I see that this then just continues left to right. And do you want to go through all of these? I mean, I'm starting to get it here. PR for privileges, none, or there's some other value, right?
Yeah.
The UI for user interaction. Scope, I don't think I would have guessed that for S.
Yeah, the whole right half of this, the other four are not as self-explanatory, and these describe what the impact is if you have been exploited. So if an attacker takes advantage of this, what can they do? In this case, the scope is unchanged. Scope meaning Basically, privileges is usually what this refers to. So anybody that takes advantage of this can't pivot necessarily to something that the service couldn't already do.
Okay.
In this case, as I mentioned, it's CIFS, which is a server service. And so if we've exploited this, the CVE and the server service probably already has root, right? It's very common for those to have root. It's a little disingenuous to say the scope is unchanged here because, yeah, sure it is, but you probably already have admin rights.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm with you here. I don't know if I would have ever guessed that that H meant total.
Yeah, H is high.
Yeah.
And in this case, high means everything. The other thing that's a little difficult to intuit here is the confidence value. So that CH value here. Confidentiality is basically your data integrity. So when the confidentiality is high, that means they can take whatever data they want. Like that's the shorthand for this. So a confidentiality loss of low would mean that they can't necessarily exfiltrate everything. But in this case, confidentiality of high means that anything that your service has access to, the attacker has access to.
Got it. So if confidentiality is data, then what's integrity?
Yeah, integrity is typically what the service does. So in this case, integrity means that the user can do other things you wouldn't expect the service to do.
Okay.
So it's a remote code execution exploit, and this is the part of it that says that code execution bit is that integrity of high.
Okay.
And then availability is just how available the service is. An attacker in this case could take the service down. You would see all of these as low and availability as high on an exploit that's like a denial of service attack.
Got it. Yep. Wow, thanks for breaking this down, because this is on all the CVEs, right? Not just the Linux ones.
Yeah, and I frequently use this when I'm not sure, it especially in the Linux space, because they're often written in that very technical way that expects you to understand the service that's being exploited. And okay. I don't understand every Linux service because I just don't. My brain does not hold all that information. So it's very useful there, but oftentimes even in the Windows space where the CVE data does go through another writer usually, and they're typically written in a more human readable way. This can be useful there because oftentimes, there will just not be enough data. The data that's there will be clear, the words will be clear, but this still helps you to understand exactly what the exploit's doing when there isn't quite enough data.
Okay. This is great, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, it's always nice to have something new to talk about.
Yeah, a little new thing here. We do have, and this is easy to have missed as a RHEL administrator, there are some new sites in BigFix for Red Hat Enterprise Linux patching. These are side channel patch sites. So okay. We were going to have, we have our main RHEL patch site, of course. These are for separate editions of Red Hat. They're essentially side operating systems. So there's Red Hat Enterprise Linux for high availability. And that's just kind of a tweaked operating system that has different things installed by default and a separate patch channel. And we haven't had support for those until now. So they're available for you.
Cool. Well, this is great, Joe. I hope you can top Rambo next month.
I can never top
Rambo. Don't say that. Never say never. If you're still watching, thank you. Like and subscribe and all that jazz. We'll have some shorts up on LinkedIn in the next day or so. Enjoy. We'll see you next month.